The insult hung in the sterile air of the hospital room like a slap, sharp and deliberate. Dr. Nathan Caldwell's voice, rich with condescension, rang out in the space, drawing uncomfortable glances from the other staff. Perhaps if you focused more on actual medicine instead of affirmative action handouts, Nurse Lewis, you wouldn't make such basic mistakes. Silence. The kind of silence that suffocates. Nurse Amara Lewis didn't flinch. Years of experience, endless training, and all the composure the world could teach her kept her rooted in place. She locked eyes with him for half a second, chin slightly lifted, expression unreadable. But her fists were clenched just enough to whiten the knuckles beneath the soft blue of her glove. In the hospital, humiliation was often delivered in whispers, sideways glances, passive-aggressive comments behind doors. But Dr. Caldwell wasn't interested in whispers. He wanted performance, dominance, spectacle. And today she had been his stage. Amara glanced at the patient. The elderly man sitting propped up in the bed watched the whole scene unfold. He looked fragile but oddly composed. No offense in his eyes. Just curiosity. Even amusement. He looked at her like he knew her. Like he was weighing something in his mind. Caldwell smirked, confident, victorious in his imagined intellectual duel. Honestly, it's impressive, he continued, adjusting the sleeves of his lab coat. Incompetence combined with entitlement. A rare cocktail. The other nurses busied themselves with charting, for stands or anything that gave the illusion of productivity. No one wanted to get involved. Not here. Not with him. Everyone knew Caldwell. A legacy doctor from a long line of surgeons. Med school royalty. Private boarding schools. Ivy League. Country club. Generational wealth wrapped in a neatly pressed lab coat. And now, apparently, determined to make an example of the black nurse he had decided was beneath him. Amara kept her voice steady. Doctor, I followed the patient's chart exactly as ordered. But Caldwell wasn't done. If you could read properly, perhaps you would have noticed I updated it this morning. Oh wait, reading comprehension's optional these days. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. Usually, Amara would keep her head down, walk out with dignity, and let the weight of professionalism win. But this time, something in the patient's steady gaze made her hesitate. There was something strange here. Something deliberate. Anything else, doctor? She asked calmly. Caldwell smirked again and waved her off, as if dismissing a waitress after a subpar meal. No. Carry on with your diversity tour. It was sharp, practiced, almost elegant in its cruelty. The patient shifted slightly on the bed, drawing Caldwell's attention momentarily. Are you comfortable, Mr. Mercer? Caldwell asked, voice dripping with that faux compassion that wealthy professionals used when speaking to people they assumed were powerless. I'm quite comfortable, thank you, the man replied, his voice soft, even. Though I must say it's enlightening to observe your team dynamics here. Caldwell chuckled as if Eli Mercer had joined his little club of superiority. You should see what I have to deal with on a regular basis. Makes you appreciate how far we've fallen in medical standards. Amara could feel the burn rise behind her ribs, but kept her face neutral. She excused herself quietly and walked out before her professionalism cracked under the pressure. Out in the hallway, heart pounding, she leaned against the wall. She could hear her grandmother's voice in her head. Don't let them break your spirit, baby. That's what they want. And they can't have it unless you hand it to them. But wasn't it exhausting? To constantly be the bigger person? To constantly let the microaggressions slide because professionalism was supposed to mean silence? And why was it her responsibility to uphold dignity when the people in power could drag it through the dirt without consequence? She was so tired. Inside the room, Eli Mercer sat still, his frail body betraying none of the strength that hummed beneath the surface of his gaze. He didn't miss much. Especially not the little things. Like how the other staff looked at Caldwell not with respect, but with fear. Or how Amara didn't retreat in shame, but in cold, calculated control. Eli wasn't just here to recover from a procedure. He had chosen this hospital on purpose, with full knowledge of its reputation for elitism hidden beneath glossy brochures promising equity. He'd seen it before. In boardrooms, in charities, in scholarships handed out by smiling men who voted against school funding behind closed doors. And now he was seeing it here, in the one place where human life was supposed to matter more than pedigree. He folded his hands across his lap and smiled slightly. The arrogance of men like Caldwell always made their downfall predictable. It was never the blatant moments that undid them, but the small miscalculations. The belief that their world was untouchable, that the people they belittled were helpless, that wealth only wore tailored suits and spoke in careful boardroom diction. What Caldwell didn't know was that Eli Mercer's name alone could turn the financial stability of this entire institution inside out. But Eli wasn't here to swing his weight like a weapon. Not yet. He preferred watching people reveal themselves, and Caldwell was performing beautifully. Meanwhile, down in the staff lounge, Amara sat alone, sipping lukewarm coffee, unsure whether the tears behind her eyes were frustration or exhaustion. The whispers from the hallways, "It's not fair, why doesn't she file a report?" all sounded the same and all of them empty. She had filed reports before. Nothing stuck. The system always found a way to wrap itself around the comfortable notion of plausible deniability. And here? Caldwell was too connected, too insulated by generational privilege, to ever be truly touched by HR memos or sensitivity training. But something told her that this time, things might be different. She couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the quiet confidence in that patient's gaze. Maybe it was because she was done shrinking to fit the roles they allowed her. Back in the patient room, Caldwell checked his watch. His shift was nearly over. Another successful display of dominance. Another day of keeping the order as it had always been. He gathered his things, preparing to dismiss Mercer with a weak smile. But Mercer spoke first. "Dr. Caldwell?" "Yes." Mercer's voice was soft but carried a subtle weight Caldwell didn't notice. "I imagine you pride yourself on being a leader here." Caldwell smiled tightly. "Naturally. That's good to know," Mercer said simply. "Leadership always has a way of revealing itself. Eventually." Caldwell missed the meaning entirely. His mind was already on evening cocktails and checking his stock portfolio. The peasant patients, the token hires, the bureaucratic annoyances, all of it background noise. As Caldwell walked away, Mercer let himself smile for real this time. Eventually. Very soon, in fact. 2 days later, the hospital buzzed with its usual rhythm. Doctors barking orders, nurses juggling charts and medications, patients flowing in and out like a current nobody could control. But beneath the surface, a subtle shift was happening, one most of them couldn't see yet. Except for a select few. Caldwell strutted through the corridors like a man who owned not just the hospital but the very air everyone breathed. Same crisp white coat. Same expensive cufflinks glinting under the LED light. Same subtle sneer when passing staff he deemed beneath him. He wasn't thinking about the encounter with Amara. To him, it was another forgettable moment in a long career of stepping on others to elevate himself. That's how it had always worked, and it had always worked. But then came the email. It pinged quietly into his inbox during his morning break. From the office of the hospital's executive board. Subject line: Immediate attention required. Attached was a short, simple memo. Mr. Eli Mercer was not just a patient. He was also the largest silent donor of their hospital's Equity and Diversity Endowment. Founder of the Mercer Initiative, a philanthropic organization dedicated to increasing representation of minority groups in medicine. And, apparently, on a quiet, self-funded visit to evaluate how his investments were being used. Caldwell reread the memo twice. A faint prickle crawled up his neck. Surely, this wasn't about him. Surely, this wasn't connected to. Another email followed minutes later. This one was a video, just under 40 seconds long. recorded discreetly by one of the medical assistants during Caldwell's verbal assault on Amara. Perfect audio. Perfect angle. No context needed. Just Caldwell's voice, dripping with contempt, making remarks that not even the board's legal team could spin into misinterpretation. And then came the realization. Someone had sent that video directly to Mercer's foundation. Not anonymously, openly. Signed, time-stamped, attached with a formal complaint citing habitual abuse of staff, discrimination, and fostering a hostile work environment. The foundation hadn't responded. Yet, they didn't have to. The threat wasn't a lawsuit. It was bigger. It was financial obliteration. Caldwell sat frozen, his mind doing frantic calculus. Mercer's connections reached deep. Endowments, grants, federal partnership, medical scholarships funded in Mercer's name had propelled hundreds of young black and brown doctors through institutions that otherwise wouldn't have let them through the door. If Mercer decided to move his philanthropy elsewhere, this hospital would lose millions in funding. Worse still, reputation, prestige, influence. This wasn't just about one bad PR cycle. This was legacy-breaking material. And the worst part? He had handed it to them. On a silver tray. But still, ego fights with reason, even when both know the outcome. Caldwell's next thought wasn't apology. It was control. Damage control, of course, but more than that, narrative control. He didn't get this far in life by letting people dictate his story. Meanwhile, Amara was standing in the supply room, staring at her phone. The same video sat in her inbox. Sent by someone she didn't know. No subject. No note. Just the raw footage of her own humiliation, crystal clear, accompanied by Caldwell's voice tearing at her dignity like claws through silk. At first, her stomach dropped. This wasn't how things were done. You filed reports. You waited. You hoped the right people cared enough to lift a finger. But this? This was exposure. Brutal. Honest. Unfiltered. It was terrifying. And liberating. She glanced at the sender's name again. A junior assistant from the admin wing, someone she barely knew. Someone who, apparently, had finally decided that silence was no longer neutral. Someone who, like her, had gotten tired of professionalism being weaponized against the people who deserved it the most. Across the hospital, words spread, not loudly, not yet, but in that low hum of suppressed gossip that floats like static between walls. Doctors checking their phones with raised eyebrows. Nurses exchanging loaded glances in the break rooms. Interns pretending not to listen but hanging on every whispered word. And somewhere deeper in that building, the administrative board was beginning to panic. Eli Mercer remained calm. He had built entire corporations on the principle that most powerful men weren't destroyed by their enemies, but by their arrogance. He had funded education programs for children who had been told by teachers that medicine was too ambitious for kids like them. He had sat in rooms where smiling politicians shook his hand while cutting programs for those same children the following week. None of it surprised him anymore. What still surprised him was how predictable people like Caldwell were. Mercer had been waiting for this opportunity, not for revenge, but for exposure. Quiet donations were no longer enough. Hidden scholarships were too soft, too polite. What was needed now was demonstration. Proof. Evidence that systemic discrimination didn't just exist, it thrived in places wearing the mask of progress. And here, in this neatly polished hospital, Mercer had found the perfect specimen. A doctor who mistook his title for moral authority. A man who believed his birthright insulated him from accountability. Caldwell's mistake wasn't just insulting Amara. His mistake was doing it in front of someone with more power than he could comprehend. But the true difference? Mercer didn't wield his power to preserve his own image. He wielded it to dismantle old systems brick by crumbling brick. And now Caldwell's entire foundation, built on legacy, on entitlement, on unchecked arrogance, had a crack running straight through it. By noon, the hospital's legal department had sent out 2 separate internal memos, one urging discretion and the other requesting urgent meetings with Caldwell. HR started crafting their carefully curated apology script. Diversity liaisons began preparing workshops that wouldn't solve anything but would photograph well for social media. But all of that machinery was irrelevant now, because the video was already circulating beyond the hospital. Social media posts, shares, comments, hashtag Mercer Initiative trending, articles being drafted. Think pieces on discrimination in healthcare being pitched to editors before lunch. And all the while, Caldwell paced his office like a lion in a shrinking cage, still clinging to the illusion that a statement, a forced apology, a resignation from a minor committee might be enough. But it wasn't. Not this time. And Amara? She stood in the hallway, phone in hand, steady for the first time in weeks. People were looking at her differently now, not with pity, but with recognition. The quiet ones, the tired ones, the ones who had folded themselves small for too long just to survive the shift. Something had shifted. Something was beginning. And Caldwell, for the first time in his privileged, meticulously insulated life, realized he wasn't going to be the one writing the ending to this story. Caldwell tried everything: calls to board members, veiled threats to junior staff, even a personal email to Mercer's foundation crafted with every ounce of manipulative charm he could summon. He used the same language that had saved him countless times before: misunderstandings, stress, miscommunication, the pressures of the profession. He even invoked the pandemic-era workload as a nostalgic excuse for frayed tempers. But none of it landed. The world outside his carefully curated reputation had changed, and he hadn't noticed. What used to pass as leadership now stank of entitlement, and the people around him were no longer afraid to say it. Mercer didn't respond to the email. Silence, Caldwell realized too late, was far more devastating than outrage. Outrage you could manipulate. Silence meant you were irrelevant. The hospital board scrambled behind closed doors. Meetings stacked on top of meetings, phone calls happening at strange hours. PR firms were quietly contacted, contingency plans reviewed. They could handle malpractice lawsuits, medical accidents, even embezzlement, but public exposure of systemic discrimination funded by the very philanthropists supporting their diversity initiatives? That was a scandal no amount of polished statements could spin. It wasn't a bad look, it was institutional hypocrisy with receipts. Meanwhile, Amara arrived for her next shift with shoulders set differently. Not with arrogance or defiance, but with resolve. People she barely knew, orderlies, interns, lab techs, offered subtle nods as she passed. Not sympathy. Solidarity. Eli Mercer had not spoken a word to her since that first encounter, but his silence was strategic, deliberate. He wasn't here to rescue anyone. He was here to expose the machine. Another email landed in the hospital's executive inbox. This time, it wasn't a complaint. It was a demand. The Mercer Initiative would not be pulling funding yet, but they wanted a full, independent review of the hospital's hiring practices, promotions, retention data on minority staff, and, most importantly, the pattern of disciplinary actions against minority nurses and doctors over the past 5 years. Mercer wasn't after one man's downfall. He was after patterns, systems. He was going for the roots, not just the branches. And this wasn't a quiet internal review. Mercer wanted it public, transparent, audited by an outside civil rights organization, with findings to be made available in national medical journals. The implication was clear. Fail to cooperate, and Mercer would take his considerable influence and his network of wealthy peers to every academic medical institution tied to this hospital's reputation. For once, Caldwell's allies in administration had no clever strategy. Their corporate sponsors wouldn't defend them. Too much risk, too much liability. The only thing left in Caldwell's arsenal was the same thing that had always insulated mediocre men in powerful positions: performative contrition. The board sent word to Caldwell. Effective immediately, he would step down from all leadership roles. Not just committees, not just public speaking engagement. Everything. Suspension pending review. Of course, they tried to sell it as mutual agreement, voluntary leave, time to reflect, but everyone knew the truth. He wasn't stepping down. He was being pushed. His formal resignation was drafted within hours, though Caldwell resisted signing it until the very last moment, jaw clenched, knuckles white. And in that moment, a deeper humiliation unfolded, not the kind seen in headlines or Twitter threads, but the personal collapse of a man who had built his entire identity on status. Caldwell had convinced himself that his education, his pedigree, his achievements protected him. But none of those things could shield him from what mattered now: evidence. Evidence that he wasn't just a bad day, a bad moment, or a misunderstood leader. He was the embodiment of the very problem medicine had been pretending didn't exist. As Caldwell's resignation quietly hit the internal newswire, Mercer prepared the next step. He wasn't interested in hollow victories. Caldwell losing his job meant nothing if the system that had created Caldwell remained untouched. Mercer drafted a public statement, not as a victim, not as a billionaire, but as an advocate. He detailed his personal experience, how casual discrimination functions not just through insults but through dismissals, silence, and apathy from those who should know better. And then came the announcement that sent shockwaves beyond the hospital walls. Mercer pledged an additional $20 million, not to the hospital itself, but to establish an independent organization tasked solely with monitoring discriminatory practices in medical institutions nationwide. It would have real enforcement teeth, connections with accreditation boards, the power to influence medical school funding, and, most importantly, platforms for minority medical staff to share their experiences without fear of retaliation. This wasn't charity anymore. This was revolution by accountability. Back inside the hospital, Amara sat in a modest break room, coffee in hand, scrolling through the waves of public response. The comments under Mercer's statement were overwhelming. Doctors of color from across the country sharing their own stories, disregarded contributions, denied promotions, subtle sabotage by superiors hiding behind academic language. Patients chiming in about disparities in their care, how assumptions about their intelligence or compliance affected diagnoses. A chorus of lived experiences, no longer hidden, no longer polite. And now there was momentum. Amara wasn't naive. She knew that Caldwell was just one man in a sea of many. Removing him didn't fix everything. But this moment wasn't about fixing everything at once. It was about starting. It was about planting a flag where silence used to reign. One of her colleagues, a young black medical resident, caught her eye across the room. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They both knew what this moment was. Not the end, not even close, but the turning of the tide. Later that afternoon, the hospital's official account released a carefully crafted statement. It was everything one might expect: acknowledgement of the unfortunate incident, a renewed commitment to diversity and inclusion, promises of future action. But beneath the surface, everyone knew that this wasn't the hospital's victory. This was survival. Reactive. Desperate. The real victory wasn't in their press releases. It was in the quiet, steady hand of Amara opening another patient's chart, confident that now, when someone disrespected her in the hallway, it wouldn't be hidden anymore. It would be recorded, remembered, challenged. And for Caldwell, sitting alone in a high-rise condo he didn't even like, staring at the resignation email he had just sent, the worst punishment wasn't the loss of position or paycheck. It was irrelevance. He had been exposed, not just as a prejudiced man, but as a small one. And the people he once saw as background scenery? They had become the architects of the story now being written. The news spread faster than anyone could have predicted. Medical forums, professional LinkedIn groups, healthcare advocacy spaces, all buzzing with the same mixture of shock, vindication, and outrage. Caldwell's name was trending for all the wrong reasons. His carefully constructed facade as a respected surgeon and thought leader in modern medicine was now associated with something far more permanent, a case study in institutional prejudice. What nobody saw coming, however, was Mercer's next move. It wasn't about Caldwell anymore. That chapter was closed. Mercer turned his attention to the ecosystem that had allowed Caldwell to thrive for so long. And with one press release, he shifted the entire conversation. This wasn't going to be a story about one arrogant doctor getting caught. It was going to be about an entire profession being forced to confront itself. Mercer announced the formation of a coalition, composed of influential philanthropists, civil rights attorneys, minority-led medical associations, and, crucially, patient advocacy groups. The coalition's single purpose: force transparency into the hiring, retention, and promotion practices of major hospitals across the country. They weren't asking, they were demanding. And their leverage wasn't just money, it was public trust, and Mercer held the keys to that narrative. For decades, hospitals had hidden behind prestige, reputation, and glossy brochures showcasing diversity as marketing prop. But now, those props were speaking, and they were tired of being silent participants in someone else's photo op. Within a week, the coalition drafted an open letter signed by over 500 healthcare professionals from prestigious institutions nationwide. This wasn't just about one hospital. It was about the patterns repeating everywhere. Stories poured in. A black pediatrician passed over for promotion 3 times despite outperforming colleagues. A Latina anesthesiologist consistently paired with less experienced surgeons under the guise of team balance. An Asian American cardiologist ignored in meetings until a white male colleague repeated her suggestion, suddenly treated as brilliant. And all of these stories shared the same thread: polished discrimination wrapped in institutional language, hidden under the veneer of meritocracy, defended by those who benefited most from maintaining the illusion of fairness. Meanwhile, Amara watched from the eye of the storm. She had no desire to become a symbol. Symbols could be dehumanized. She wanted something better: impact. And that meant staying sharp, professional, calm under pressure. Every step she took was watched now, not just by supporters, but by critics searching for any misstep to discredit her legitimacy. What they didn't expect was that Amara didn't need to prove her worth anymore. Her career, her training, her compassion for patients, that was her proof. Everything else was noise. Then came the call that shifted the landscape again. The National Board of Medical Accreditation wanted a meeting with her. At first, Amara was skeptical. Was this going to be another PR stunt to save face? A ceremonial meeting to make the headlines look progressive? But when she joined the call, it was clear. This was real. They wanted her insight, not just as a nurse, but as someone who had endured the system and survived its quiet violence. The NBMA didn't just want input on diversity programs. They wanted to restructure continuing education requirements to include mandatory cultural competency modules taught by practitioners like her. Real stories. Real experiences. No sanitized textbook summaries. The kind of uncomfortable truths medical schools usually avoided because it threatened the fragile egos of their alumni donors. Amara agreed on one condition: she would not be the token face of someone else's reform. She would help, she would guide, she would speak, but she would not be anyone's mascot. They could work with her, not use her. Meanwhile, Mercer moved with precision. Behind closed doors, he met with other billionaires, many of them indifferent at first, some skeptical. Why focus on hospitals when there were flashier causes? But Mercer's pitch was airtight. Systemic discrimination in medicine kills people. Not metaphorically, literally. Implicit bias leads to misdiagnosis, unequal pain treatment, disparities in maternal mortality rate. Racism wasn't just unfair, it was deadly. By framing it not as charity but as a national health emergency, Mercer shifted wealthy benefactors into stakeholders. They didn't want their legacies tied to broken systems. They wanted to fund the solution. Within 3 weeks, the coalition's funding had quadrupled. And then, almost quietly, something remarkable began to happen. Younger doctors and nurses, across racial and ethnic lines, started stepping forward. Social media filled with videos, articles, podcasts. What I saw in medical school, why my colleague was fired for speaking up, the silent rules of medical hierarchies. Each story added fuel to the growing inferno of truth long hidden by professional courtesy and institutional complicity. Medical students started organizing workshops independent of their faculty's permission. Residents formed peer support groups. Even some senior doctors, sensing the cultural tide shifting, offered apologies for past complacency, not performative but vulnerable, admitting they should have spoken sooner. For the first time in decades, the culture of silence in medicine was cracking. But not everyone was pleased. Anonymous emails, predictable backlash, accusations of playing the race card flooded Amara's inbox. Cowardly, pathetic, transparent attempts to protect a status quo built on exclusion. Amara didn't respond to any of them. She didn't have to. The truth was doing all the work for her now. What stung her most wasn't the open hostility, it was the silence of some she once called friends. People she had trained with, shared meals with, stayed late in operating rooms with, suddenly pretending they didn't know her. Their avoidance spoke volumes. They weren't against her, but they weren't for her either. And neutrality, Amara had learned, was just another flavor of betrayal. Still, there were more victories than defeats now. Letters of support from Black nursing associations. Invitations to speak at medical ethics conferences. A personal note from a senior oncologist admitting that Mercer's actions had forced him to confront his own unconscious bias. And perhaps the most satisfying moment of all, when the hospital where it all began quietly updated their internal HR policies to mandate that every disciplinary action against minority staff required oversight by an independent equity officer. No more whispered firings. No more personality conflicts used as cover for racism. Checks and balances had arrived. And through it all, Mercer never asked for credit. He didn't post selfies with activists. He didn't sit on talk shows. He let the work speak because that's how legacy is built, not through applause but through undeniable impact. For the first time, Amara allowed herself a moment of stillness, not as a victor, not as a survivor, but as a builder. She wasn't finished. None of them were. But the foundation was there now. What began as humiliation for her was now humiliation for an entire system that thought it was untouchable. Not anymore. The invitations went out quietly, discreetly, with the kind of elegant minimalism that only the wealthy truly understand. No fanfare, no public posts, just a crisp white envelope embossed with the Mercer Foundation insignia, delivered to the inner circles of medicine, philanthropy, and business. A gala unlike any other. Not a charity dinner, not an awards show. This was something else entirely. This was going to be the reckoning dressed in black tie. The setting was perfect. A historic building repurposed as a museum of medical advancement, lined with portraits of pioneers in lab coats, almost exclusively white, almost exclusively male. The symbolism was intentional. Mercer didn't pick it by accident. Every person walking into that hall would feel the weight of that legacy, and the contradiction it now represented. Caldwell received his invitation too. Of course, it wasn't personal. The list was compiled by staff, and on paper, he still carried titles, still sat on boards, still represented prestige. He told himself attending was a good PR move, a way to remind everyone that one misunderstanding didn't erase decades of expertise. But beneath the tailored suit, Caldwell was sweating. He knew something was shifting, even if he didn't yet understand the full scale of it. Amara stood by the entrance, not as a guest, not as an ornament, but as a partner. Her role wasn't ceremonial, it was strategic. Everyone in that room knew who she was now. No whispers, no glances over champagne flute. Direct eye contact. Some eyes held respect, others discomfort, but nobody ignored her anymore. The speeches were short, sharp, and devastatingly precise. Mercer didn't talk about discrimination as a vague social ill. He talked numbers, studies, names, and case histories of people whose lives had been shortened or destroyed by medical bias. By the time he was done, you could feel the collective discomfort of generational wealth realizing their money had, 4 years, gone to hospitals with beautiful buildings but rotten floors beneath the marble. But Mercer wasn't here for guilt. He was here for contracts. That's when the screens lit up, not with promotional videos but with recorded testimonies. Doctors, nurses, patients, some well-known, others anonymous by necessity, all telling the same story in different voices. Discrimination in medicine isn't rare. It's policy, dressed in polite words, hidden behind academic credentials. And then came the twist nobody expected. Mercer wasn't just asking for donations. He was proposing binding commitments. Written, enforceable pledges from every major hospital accepting private or public funding. Those who signed on would be the first wave of reform, publicly supported by the coalition, backed by grants and resources. Those who didn't, well, the coalition had already reserved full-page ads in major newspapers to start asking uncomfortable questions. It wasn't coercion. It was accountability. And for once, it wasn't optional. Caldwell's discomfort escalated to visible anxiety. He wasn't the focus anymore, but the system that protected him was now on fire, and Mercer was holding the torch. Amara didn't gloat. That wasn't her style. But she allowed herself a single breath of satisfaction when she caught Caldwell trying to disappear into the crowd of donors. It was poetic, almost pathetic, to see a man who once stood proudly on stages now shrinking among the very people he once sought to impress. But the true victory wasn't Caldwell's humiliation. It was what happened next. Hospital CEOs started signing the pledges, not all at once but steadily, each signature emboldening the next. The room filled with the sharp click of pens on thick cardstock, a sound more satisfying than any applause. What began as a scandal had transformed into a full-scale movement, documented live, shared across encrypted networks by advocates ready to broadcast it the moment the gala ended. The coalition didn't stop at racial discrimination. The pledges included gender equity, protections for LGBTQ+ staff, mechanisms for whistleblowers, and independent audit. Comprehensive, uncompromising, uncomfortable for those who profited from silence. And still, Mercer wasn't finished. He announced the creation of a scholarship fund in Amara's name, not a handout, but a structured program designed to bring underrepresented students into medical fields with mentorship, clinical experience, and financial backing that bypassed traditional institutional bottleneck. It wasn't charity. It was reparative architecture, rebuilding a pipeline broken by generations of bias. Amara stood, reluctantly accepting the recognition, not because she wanted her name in lights but because she understood what it meant for the next nurse, the next doctor, the next kid watching from a neighborhood like hers thinking they didn't belong in spaces like this. Now they would have a path not paved by tokenism, but by earned respect and strategic infrastructure. Caldwell finally slipped out, unnoticed by most, irrelevant to the moment that wasn't his anymore. What nobody saw was that Mercer already had legal teams preparing the next phase. Contracts with educational institutions, endowments to medical schools, partnerships with civil rights organizations. Tonight was the spark. The structure being built would outlast every person in that room. And perhaps the most powerful shift of all came not in speeches or signatures, but in the quiet conversations at cocktail tables between younger doctors challenging their mentors. Why didn't we know this sooner? Why weren't we taught this in rotations? What else are we missing because we've been comfortable? It wasn't about one scandal anymore. It was about the fundamental DNA of how medicine worked. Amara didn't need to forgive Caldwell, and she didn't try. Forgiveness wasn't required to build progress. Accountability was. And she wasn't there for revenge, she was there for results. As the event wrapped up, Mercer leaned over to Amara with a quiet smile, a rare one for a man so focused on structure over sentiment. "This is what legacy looks like," he said. "Not plaques. Not awards. Systems. Permanent systems." She nodded, knowing that while the fight wasn't over, for the first time, they weren't alone in it. Out in the streets, media vans waited, influencers primed to dissect every contract, activists ready to make sure promises were kept. A new era had begun, not because of spectacle but because of organization. And in the months that followed, patients began to notice too. More diverse medical staff. More translators for immigrant families. Doctors asking better questions, not assuming symptoms based on stereotype. Change wasn't instant, but it was finally visible. The hypocrisy that protected egos was being replaced by a new culture, one that valued the lives of patients more than the reputations of institutions. Ego fell. Classism cracked. Hypocrisy burned. And from it rose something better, leadership rooted in truth. Legacy rooted in action. And a new generation ready to build what the old one refused to. In the weeks after the gala, the ripple effect spread faster than anyone anticipated. What began as a single event became a sustained movement, each wave bringing with it more scrutiny, more voices, and more change. Social media platforms that usually thrived on outrage now buzzed with organized campaigns. Hashtags evolved from performative sympathy to actionable demand. Articles dissected the contracts hospitals had signed, with legal experts breaking down the language for public consumption. People were learning not just the stories of injustice, but the mechanisms that enabled them. It was no longer about isolated incidents. It was systemic, and now the public finally saw it. The Mercer Foundation's team worked tirelessly behind the scenes, not basking in publicity but strategizing the next layers of reform. Calls were being made to law schools, bringing in civil rights attorneys to establish pro bono networks for medical workers facing retaliation when they spoke up. Whistleblower protections were put to the test immediately. Within days, stories began surfacing from inside hospitals. Nurses and technicians emboldened by the public support started naming names, citing incidents of bias that had previously been swept under sterile rugs. Caldwell, meanwhile, couldn't escape the consequences. His name became synonymous with the old guard, a relic of privilege masquerading as merit. Not just because of his treatment of Amara, but because his arrogance embodied the kind of thinking that allowed medical negligence to thrive in marginalized communities. He was invited to step down from advisory board. Research papers he'd authored were revisited with scrutiny, revealing uncomfortable patterns of exclusion in citations and co-authorship. His carefully curated career began to unravel, not through scandal alone, but through exposure of long-standing hypocrisy hidden in plain sight. Amara didn't engage in personal attack. She didn't need to. The system was doing that work now. Instead, she focused on shaping the positive narrative, appearing in interviews, not as a victim, but as an expert, an advocate, someone who understood both the compassion and the cruelty of healthcare systems. Her voice wasn't angry, it was precise. And that precision cut deeper than rage ever could. One major interview changed everything. A respected journalist conducted a sit-down conversation with Amara and Mercer, broadcast live to millions. There, Amara articulated something few had dared to say in public forums before. That diversity wasn't just about fairness, it was about survival. Bias in medicine didn't just offend sensibilities, it cost lives. Misdiagnosis due to racial assumptions. Dismissal of pain reports from marginalized patients. Lack of cultural competency in treatment plans. This wasn't about optics, it was about mortality. That interview reshaped the debate. Suddenly, what had been perceived as a social issue became a matter of life and death. Hospitals that previously dragged their feet now scrambled to issue statements, launch diversity task forces, and seek partnerships with the very coalitions that had forced their hand. Some were genuine. Others were terrified of being next in the crosshairs of a growing national conversation. Students in medical schools began organizing too. Quietly at first, but then publicly, with student councils drafting letters demanding curriculum changes. They didn't just want a seminar on unconscious bias. They wanted systemic overhaul, courses dedicated to the history of racial disparities in healthcare, practical training in treating diverse populations, and mentorship programs connecting students to leaders like Amara. The old guard resisted, citing tradition and academic standards, but the momentum was undeniable. And then came the unexpected allies. Several retired physicians, once silent, complicit by comfort, started coming forward with their own stories. Regrets about careers spent overlooking these issues. Stories of students they'd discouraged from speaking up. Tearful admissions of ignorance cloaked in professionalism. These confessions didn't erase harm, but they added weight to the argument that this wasn't new, just newly visible. For every door that closed, 10 more opened. Foundations unrelated to Mercer's began contributing funds. Independent filmmakers started documenting the movement's rise. Educational influencers on platforms normally reserved for lifestyle content started breaking down the systemic problems in healthcare, translating dense research into accessible media for millions of young viewers. What had started as one arrogant doctor's mistake became a blueprint for dismantling prejudice with precision. Caldwell tried to reclaim relevance. A carefully crafted apology letter circulated, clearly written by public relations experts, not by a man who had learned anything. It fell flat. People recognized the difference between regret over consequences and actual accountability. The world had moved on, not away from him, but beyond him. Meanwhile, Amara's scholarship program filled quickly. Hundreds of applications poured in from students across the country, some of them the first in their families to pursue medicine. Their essays didn't just speak of dreams. They spoke of burdens, of being underestimated, of fighting through underfunded schools, of translating for family members in medical appointments, of working 2 jobs to keep up with tuition. These weren't charity cases. They were the future of healthcare demanding to be let in. Mentorship networks began forming organically. Nurses reached out to prospective students. Doctors who once ignored these conversations started showing up in advisory groups. Not all of them knew exactly what they were doing, but they were willing to listen, willing to change. That willingness mattered more than perfection. Even within hospital systems, you could feel the tremors of transformation. Performance evaluations for physicians now included not just clinical outcomes but interpersonal competence. Did you listen to your patients? Did you take cultural background into account before making recommendations? Did you advocate for your colleagues who raised concerns about bias? Suddenly, medical excellence wasn't defined solely by technical skill, it included humanity. It was uncomfortable. Some resisted. Some mocked the efforts as woke nonsense, clinging desperately to the fading comfort of homogeneity. But their voices, once dominant, were now background noise to a rising chorus of people who knew that better healthcare wasn't just possible, it was mandatory. Amara's leadership wasn't performative, and she didn't aspire to be anyone's hero. What made her different was her insistence on process over platitude. Her strength wasn't in shouting the loudest, but in structuring change so thoroughly that it couldn't be undone by the next news cycle's distraction. Mercer continued doing what he did best, building behind the scenes, connecting the dots that others didn't even know existed. While the media spotlight moved elsewhere, the infrastructure being created remained firm. Contract, endowments, bylaws, recruitment pathways. Not hashtags, but handshakes that actually moved money, policy, and opportunity. What no one could deny now was that this wasn't about a moment, it was about a movement. And unlike movements driven by spectacle, this one was designed to endure. Because it was built not just on outrage but on organization. Not just on emotions but on education. Not just on exposure but on execution. In the end, the true story wasn't the downfall of one arrogant doctor. It was the rise of a new framework for leadership in medicine, one rooted not in protecting privilege, but in protecting life. And that framework was now in motion, unstoppable, irreversible, and destined to outlive the very institutions that once refused to imagine anything better. Months later, the legacy of what began as humiliation had crystallized into something much larger than any of the individuals involved. It was no longer about Amara alone, or Mercer, or even the hospital that tried to pretend none of it had happened. The conversation had matured into an undeniable cultural shift. The arrogance that once protected mediocre leadership was no longer enough to keep truth buried. What stood in its place was something far more resilient: community, accountability, and transformation that could not be staged or faked. The scholarship program, once considered a symbolic gesture, was now producing its first tangible results. Young students from marginalized backgrounds were entering clinical rotations, standing in white coats inside hospitals that had once subtly pushed them to the margins. These students didn't walk in timidly. They came armed with the knowledge of what had unfolded before them, carrying stories of the very biases they now stood to dismantle from the inside. Some of them wore pins with Amara's Foundation's emblem, not for vanity, but as silent reminders of why they were there and who they represented. Mentorship programs that started as simple weekly video calls grew into structured leadership pipelines. Formerly isolated nursing students now had direct lines to senior practitioners across the country. Instead of struggling alone through underfunded programs, they had advocates reading their applications, helping prepare for board exams, and connecting them to internship opportunities that were previously gatekept by old networks of privilege. It wasn't just about access, it was about belonging. Mercer's role remained as invisible as he liked it. He didn't attend ribbon cuttings. He didn't posture on media circuit. His wealth was doing the talking, redirected funds quietly altering hospital budgets, revising outdated hiring practices, funding research programs focused on racial disparities in medicine, and creating protected positions for scholars whose research had previously been ignored. These weren't favors. These were investments in the future of healthcare. Caldwell, stripped of his professional titles, drifted into a different kind of irrelevance. Attempts to start a podcast aimed at challenging cancel culture failed to gain traction. Invitations to conferences dried up. His colleagues didn't disavow him out of newfound morality, but from sheer practicality. They didn't want to be seen aligning with someone who had become a symbol of systemic failure. That kind of exile didn't come from vindictiveness. It came from a profession slowly recognizing that competence had to include character. Meanwhile, other industries started taking notice. Law schools began examining how racial bias operated in medical malpractice cases. Journalists started uncovering similar patterns of arrogance and classism in academic publishing, biotech hiring, and pharmaceutical research trials. The lesson learned was painfully simple. Wherever power accumulated without accountability, someone paid the price, and it was rarely those in power. Amara stood firm in the center of this cultural recalibration, not as a celebrity but as a standard. She kept emphasizing that this wasn't a fight to elevate one person, one profession, or one institution. It was about breaking cycles. Patterns of humiliation, exclusion, and performative allyship had lasted for decades because no one stayed at the table long enough to rebuild it. She intended to change that. Every interview she gave returned to the same message. Change is not a moment, it's a commitment. What surprised everyone most wasn't just the breadth of the movement but its emotional undercurrent. Empathy became fashionable again, not as empty sentiment but as structured action. Students didn't just advocate for themselves, they advocated for the patients they hadn't yet met. They knew the stakes were higher than their own futures. They were fighting for grandmothers who'd been ignored in ERs, for children who'd been misdiagnosed out of laziness, for communities that distrusted hospitals because hospitals had taught them to. Forgiveness was part of the process, but not the kind people expected. It wasn't about forgiving individuals like Caldwell for the sake of appearances. It was about forgiving themselves, for the years they stayed silent, for the opportunities they let pass by, for the fear that had once kept them complicit in systems they didn't believe in. That forgiveness allowed people to move forward without shame paralyzing their ability to act. It wasn't soft, it was strategic. Leadership redefined itself too. No longer could someone call themselves a leader based solely on credentials or tenure. Leadership now required proximity to the communities served. If a doctor or administrator couldn't speak to how their policies affected marginalized patients, they weren't leading, they were managing decline. That distinction, once blurred by professional jargon, now became sharp, undeniable, and actionable. Hospitals began competing not just on technological innovation but on inclusivity metric. Diversity was no longer relegated to a side committee buried in bureaucracy. Now it was a key performance indicator reported to stakeholders, boards of directors, and the communities those hospitals claimed to serve. In some places, hospital executives were replaced entirely with new leadership committed to the work. It was messy. It was imperfect. But it was happening. The most striking transformation, however, was psychological. For too long, people in positions of privilege saw humility as weakness. The events set in motion by that one humiliating encounter flipped the script. Now, arrogance looked like incompetence. Defensive posturing looked like fragility. And humility? It looked like strength, intelligence, and readiness to lead the future of medicine. Legacy was no longer something written in awards or honorary titles. It was written in outcomes. How many students graduated who otherwise wouldn't have made it? How many patients were heard who otherwise would have been dismissed? How many lives were saved not by machines, but by the audacity of someone finally asking the right questions in the right rooms? Growth wasn't just individual anymore, it was institutional. Systems that previously claimed, "we've always done it this way," found themselves reckoning with a new truth. That tradition without scrutiny was just stagnation in disguise. The uncomfortable conversations didn't end with Caldwell. They spread across staff meetings, residency programs, boardrooms, and even medical school classrooms. Professors who once rolled their eyes at woke politics found themselves challenged by students unwilling to accept outdated norms disguised as rigor. Mercer didn't need applause. His satisfaction came from watching those who once felt invisible now walk with their shoulders squared and their voices steady. Watching rooms of future surgeons and nurses and public health leaders speak not just about what they wanted to achieve for themselves, but what they intended to dismantle for everyone else. That was victory. Not personal vindication, but collective elevation. In the end, the hospital that thought it could bury bias beneath sterile professionalism became the birthplace of a movement bigger than anyone could have predicted. The humiliation they thought would silence a single nurse instead exposed a fault line that split their world open, forcing light into places that had remained dark for far too long. No single victory could dismantle an entire system of prejudice. But this was no longer about single victories. It was about sustained change, about the refusal to forget once the headlines faded, about ordinary people refusing to accept ordinary injustices as the price of doing business. And because of that, medicine itself, its practice, its culture, its leadership, would never be the same again.